Before I start this story, I just want you to know that it's for educational purpose, and I mean no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this case, and I upload once or twice a week. This story is very disturbing and disgusting to think human being can do such evil things to people, and as such, viewer discretion is advised. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born on September 29, 1941, at Bickerton Cottage, Much Marcle. He was the first surviving child of his parents, Walter Stephen West and Daisy Hannah Hill. Fred was from a poor family of farm workers, close-knit and mutually protective. His father was a disciplinarian and his mother overprotective. Fred's mother had given birth to 8 children, 6 of whom survived. Fred was always his mother's favorite. He was seen as a mother's boy and relied mostly on his siblings for companionship. Fred's classmates recall him as dirty, untidy, dull, and regularly in trouble. Throughout his life, he remained barely literate, yet displayed an aptitude for woodwork and artwork. He left school in December 1956 at the age of 15, first working as a laborer. Fred claimed he was sexually abused by his mother and he thought it was normal by then. At age 17, Fred suffered a fractured skull, a broken arm, and a broken leg in a motorcycle accident. He was unconscious for 7 days and walked with braces for several months. Because of this incident, he developed an extreme fear of hospitals and became prone to fits of rage. 2 years later, Fred suffered a further head injury when a girl he groped on a fire escape punched him, sending him falling 2 floors. Fred's 13-year-old sister, Kitty, told her mother that Fred had raped and had impregnated her. Fred was arrested, but his sister changed her mind and refused to testify, and the case collapsed. So, in 1962, Fred met his first wife. She was a Scottish woman named Catherine Costello, but she went by the name Rena. He actually met her because at the time he was a truck driver and she hitched a ride on his truck. What's really interesting is Rena was already pregnant at the time that she met Fred, and the two of them ended up coming up with a plan. They agreed to say that the baby was Fred's and that she had come to England to be with Fred, her baby daddy. They also decided to get married, mostly out of convenience, so that she could stay in England. And then in 1963, Rena had this baby and they named her Charmaine. However, their little plan didn't work out so well, because she ended up looking way different than Fred. Her father was Pakistani, and Fred was English. So, people figured it out pretty quick. So they decided to come up with this story that she was adopted instead. After Charmaine was born, Rena and Fred decided that they would move to Glasgow, Scotland. Once they were in Glasgow, Fred found out that Rena was actually a stripper. But he didn't really mind this. Not long after Charmaine was born, they had another daughter. This time it was Fred's actual biological daughter. And her name was Anna Marie West. So then in 1964, Fred decided to get a job. Fred decided he wants to be an ice cream man. It was during this time that he met Anne McFall. She was a younger woman and Fred grew close with her pretty quickly. And was also a pretty damaged person. She would tell Fred about how her mother was an alcoholic and would use her. And she would also sell her body for drinks, so he ended up convincing her to get out of that situation and come live with him and Rena instead. He said that she could stay as long as she needed to. So she accepted this offer and moved in. So Fred continued as an ice cream man into 1965. And one day he ended up accidentally hitting a 4-year-old boy. Now this was an accident as far as we know. He killed this little boy and he was in no way convicted or held responsible in any way. So just again reinforcing that idea that you can do anything you want as long as you get away with it. In December of 1965, Fred decided that he was going to leave Glasgow, leave Rena, and take his children with him, back to Much Marcle. And at one point, he ended up handing the 2 girls off to social services voluntarily, because he was busy basically. He couldn't find someone to watch them while he was at work. But this is when Anne McFall really came into the picture, and the 2 of them became really close. Soon that developed into a relationship, and within months, she became pregnant. So he had a whole new little life set up, a new kind of stepmom in place of Rena. But eventually Rena came home. And she actually just showed up at the house. She didn't tell Fred that she was coming. And this was unfortunate for Fred because he had been hiding that he had a pregnant girlfriend living with him during all these months. So he decided that he had to hide in. And so in McFall was last seen in 1967. And Fred claimed that he just moved her to a different location so that Rena wouldn't find out about her. He said that she moved to an RV park and that she died there. He said he was actually the one who found her in her trailer. And the body was in a suitcase. So and was never reported missing, but her body was eventually found, or what was left of it. She was found buried at the edge of a cornfield between Much Markle and Kempley in June 1994, and warning, this is gruesome, but her body had been dissected, her limbs had been carefully cut off, her bones were missing from her body and her unborn child was cut from her womb. At first, Fred denied that he had anything to do with it, but later on, when he was in jail, he had a visitor come and he confessed to them that he had stabbed her to death following a violent argument, but after and was taking care of Fred invited Rena back into his home. So she moved back in, and a little while after living together, they decided to move again. This time, they relocated to Lake House Caravan Park, and at first, their relationship had improved, they were happy together, but eventually, she decided to leave Fred again about a year after they got back together. And she decided to just leave her kids with Fred that he could raise them, which is very scary. She wasn't completely out of their life, though. She was still in contact with him here and there, but later on, she became very concerned about her daughters. She regretted leaving and she actually wanted custody of her kids. Once again, she became very depressed and anxious about how they were doing and what Fred could have been doing to them, and the guilt just really got to her. So eventually she got up the courage to ask Fred, who was a very scary person. I'm sure she was terrified to do this, but she decided to ask him if she could get to be of the kids. And this was the last time that Rena was ever seen. Investigators believe that she was strangled in the back of Fred's car. However, they really can't tell much because her body was not discovered until 20 years after she was killed. Her body was found in 1994, and one horrific detail is she was found with a small pipe-like metal tube, almost just a short piece of it, and investigators believe that she was possibly sexually assaulted with this piece of metal. Rena's body was extensively dismembered. Fred put her body into multiple bags and buried her under a cluster of trees. And like I said, she was dismembered and completely cut apart, including her head cut off, and Fred just buried her out there. And he said that he was so good at concealing a body that it didn't look like anything had been done in that area. You would have no idea there was a person who had just been buried there. Then he gathered up all of Rena's clothes, and he set them on fire to hide the evidence. And shockingly, this would actually be the 10th murder that Fred West committed. So, now that Fred is clear of any women, he doesn't have Anne and he doesn't have Rena. He's on the market for a new woman. Fred first encountered Rosemary Letts in 1969, shortly after her 15th birthday. He met her when she was 15, and the two of them actually met at a bus station, and at first Rose was really disgusted by Fred. He was absolutely disgusting, and this man had no sense of hygiene. He barely showered, he barely ever brushed his teeth, his breath was said to be very bad, he was dirty, he was nasty inside and out. But Fred was very charming, and eventually, he got Rose to be interested in him. Rose loved any attention, especially from men, because she was so broken inside from her own father, and her mother too. Fred came to the bus stop every day for days to try to win over Rose. He was not a man to give up. He was all about getting what he wanted, so he asked her twice and she said no twice. But the third time was a charm. And eventually Rose decided to go ahead and go out on a date with Fred, and from their first conversation they were already talking about sex. And Fred found out that even though Rose hadn't yet had a boyfriend, that she was very promiscuous and sexually experienced person. He also decided that one of the ways he was going to win her over was by getting sympathy from her. He made up a lie that his ex-wife left him with both of their children. He said he longed for a wife to fill that role for the kids, and that he also wanted more children with someone else. So within weeks of meeting Fred, Rose was convinced by him to become their nanny. At the time she was working at a bread shop, but she really didn't like her job. So she quickly switched over to being a nanny, and was happy to do it. And the two of them made an agreement that Fred would pay her enough that she could trick her parents into thinking that she was still working at the bread shop. But she really just wanted this whole nanny position to be a cover for her moving in with Fred and dating him. This went on for several months, and eventually Rose started falling a little bit for Fred. And she decided to introduce him to her family. And when her family met him, they did not approve. They thought he was way too old for her. Remember, she's 15 at this time, and her parents ended up being so concerned that they actually went to social services about this. They heard rumors that Fred was involved in prostitution, and they were very concerned that he had their 15-year-old daughter living with him. So in response to this, Rose was actually placed in a home for troubled teenagers, and Fred wasn't able to keep her at his house because he was in jail at the time for 30 days, for some fine. But as soon as Fred was out of jail, Rose moved right back with him. During this time, Fred's daughter, Charmaine, and Anna Marie were in the care of social services, but as soon as Frank got out, he got them back. Rose's father made one more attempt to get Rose to not be with Fred, and in February of 1970, Rose was examined by a police surgeon, and they confirmed that Rose was pregnant. She was only 15 and pregnant with Fred West's kid. Because of that, she was placed back into social services again, but she was discharged on March 6 because they came to this agreement that she was going to terminate the pregnancy and return home to her family and pretty much never talk about it again. But as soon as she got out, she changed her mind. She decided to keep the baby and moved in with Fred full-time. So, 3 months later, they left their house and relocated to the ground floor of a 2-story house in Midland Road, and on October 17, 1970, Rose gave birth to their first daughter together, and her name was Heather. And 2 months after this, Fred was in prison for theft of car tires. He ended up serving 6.5 months in prison, and during this time, Rose was 17 years old. She just turned 17 and was stuck with 3 daughters by herself while her husband is in jail. She tried to be the best mother that she could, but that was not the case. She became extremely abusive of the 3 children. This was mostly focused on Anna and Charmaine since they were not her children. She gave them verbal abuse, she beat them, and apparently Charmaine didn't show any sign of being upset by this. She wouldn't cry, she wouldn't really have much of reaction to anything that Rose was doing to her, and this would only make Rose more mad and trying to hurt her more. Hospital records had actually shown that Charmaine received a really bad ankle injury. It was like a puncture wound, and this was in March of 1971. But Rose just told the people at the hospital that this was just a household incident, but it's very unlikely. And over time, Rose's hatred for Charmaine just grew and grew. Fred's release date from prison was supposed to be June 24, and on June 15, Rose took the girls to go visit him, and this would be the last time that Fred would see Charmaine. Sometime shortly after they visited him in prison, Charmaine was killed by Rose, and Rose just went ahead and threw her body in their coal cellar, until Fred was out of prison and able to take care of it. It's not like Fred came home and was upset. He was like, whatever. I don't really care, she's not my daughter, until he ended up burying her in their backyard, close to their back door. And just like his other victims, bones were found missing from her remains when she was finally discovered. And one thing about Fred in this case was that he was into kneecap. He took every victim's kneecap and he liked to keep them in his house, but also her fingers, her wrist, her toe was missing. He liked small bones, and around this time they decided to move again, but this time to 25th Cromwell Street, the very famous house. Shortly after giving birth to their second daughter, Rose decided to become a prostitute, and she would advertise her services in a local magazine. And she transformed their upstairs room into this kind of sex room where she could have her clients come, and it seemed like Rose really preferred to have sex with women, and she liked to be very brutal to her partners and gradually get worse and worse as it went on. If they expressed any pain or fear or resisted in any way, this would excite her more. She was known for asking, "Are you woman enough to take it now?" Fred wasn't left out of this. He was often invited to be part of threesome with Rose and her clients, and eventually Fred got to a point where all he wanted was very rough and violent sexually encounters. The two of them were both into this, and they had a large collection of bondage, but they even used devices to restrain people like chains and whips. So the room that Rose would use for her work was called Rose's room. So they put holes into walls of the room so that Fred could secretly watch into Rose's room when she was with her clients without them knowing. Not only that, he even installed a baby monitor in the room so that he could listen to what Rose was doing in that room at any time, wherever he was in the house. This room even had a private bar in it, and there was a red light installed outside of the door so that everyone in the house would know not to bother Rose when she was in there busy. Now Rose's father, Bill, was protective of Rose in a way and did not want her to be with Fred. However, he was fine being with his daughter himself. He became one of her clients, and he would visit often, and they would have sex. Rose had quite a few children. By 1983, she had 8 children, and it was said that at least 3 of them are not Fred's children. They're most likely her clients, or possibly even her father's. However, this didn't really bother Fred, and he gladly accepted those children as his own. Now, as you can imagine, Fred and Rose were not good parents to these 8 children. Rose and Fred ended up being very, very strict on their children to the point where they were controlling everything. They didn't even want them to socialize or go out in public ever without them there. They had a strict guidelines. They had to do chores from age 7, which is something that's abnormal, and if they didn't follow the rules, or they messed up in any way, they were getting severe punishments that were almost always physical. And between 1972 and 1992, the West children were admitted to the Accident and Emergency Department of local hospitals at least 31 times. And all of these injuries were explained as normal household accidents. By 1992, Fred and Rose ended up having 11 children, and they called it their family of love, even though 2 of them had already been killed. In 1992, there were rumors that Fred had been raping his children, and because of this police ended up raiding his house, and when they did, they found out about Rose's prostitution services that she was advertising in magazines under the name Mandy. And there was also a big collection of adult tapes, some of them featured children and people being tortured, and at one point Fred had even filmed the rape of his daughter. So police decided to take 5 of their children away, only 5 of them, so Heather was their oldest daughter together. The first daughter that Rose had, and she disappeared from the house in 1986, and this wasn't known for a long time. But the reason why they figured this out is because Fred would actually make jokes to the other kids in the family about how their older sister was buried under their back porch, and that if they didn't behave, they would end up dead and buried under the patio just like her. Investigators believe that this statement was probably true, and it wasn't just some family joke, and it took them about 18 months to gather enough evidence to go ahead and dig up the backyard and find Heather. But they finally did on February 23 in 1994, when everything started to unravel for Fred and Rose. They finally were able to bring a search warrant to 25th Cromwell Street to Fred and Rose, and when they did, Rose was the one who answered the door, and it said that when she saw the search warrant, she screamed, "Get Fred." So she knew at that point it was over for them, and when police first got there, they started asking Rose about where Heather was, and Rose started getting extremely defensive and aggressive with them, like screaming at them, which makes no sense because this is her firstborn daughter. So they ended up not searching that day, but the next day, Fred actually went down to the police department to kind of make fun of them. He made fun of them for believing the family joke about Heather being buried under the patio, basically saying that they were idiots for believing that that was actually true. But the next day, February 25th, the police decided to go ahead and dig up the patio. In the early morning hours of February 25th, Fred went up to his oldest son, who was getting ready for work, and told him he has done something very bad, and he said, "Look after Mum and sell the house when I'm gone." And shortly after this, the police returned to the house and they were ready to dig, and surprisingly, as soon as they showed up, Fred actually indicated that he wanted to be arrested. He said he needed to be held accountable for Heather's murder after all. So he was taken to the police station to provide a full confession, and then he was arrested. He formally admitted that he did kill Heather. He said that he had killed her in a fit of rage by strangling her. It was a kind of impulsive thing that he didn't really plan out, and then he dismembered her body with a serrated knife that he normally used for cutting meats. He stored her remains in a trash can until he was able to find time to dig her grave, and at this time Fred was insistent that Rose had nothing to do with the murder. So eventually, Fred's lawyer came to the police station, and at this point, Fred was telling the police all the gory, horrible details about Heather's murder. So now it was time for them to locate Heather's remains and prove this story true. But 3 days after searching the property, they were still unable to find Heather's remains, and at that point, he started to change his story. Also, police had given him some value, which will make him start changing his story a little bit. But he started telling them how Heather was probably alive and well, she was probably fine. He said that she actually worked for the drug cartel and that she might be in Bahrain, and he said whether you believe that or not it's up to you guys. Fred started to go with this for a little while, but it didn't last long because on February 26, they did find a bone of a female in the backyard. It was a female femur bone, and as soon as they told him about this, he said, "That's Heather, I killed my daughter." So after they found Heather's body, they thought maybe Rose was in danger, and so they put her into a safe house and they started recording everything that she said. She talks about being furious with Fred, so only 2 hours after the remains were found, there was another discovery. They pulled out a couple more femur bones and soon they had 3, which means that there was more than one person buried in that yard. So they gave Fred the opportunity to explain the bones and who it belonged to, and this is when he confessed to another murder, an 18-year-old woman named Shirley Robinson. Shirley Robinson was a woman that Fred had an affair with in 1978 and he got her pregnant. Again, he ended up strangling Shirley, dismembered her and then buried her in the backyard. And at that time, she was 8 months pregnant. So by the end of that night on February 26, Fred had confessed to 2 murders, then he had a cigarette break and during that cigarette break, he was talking to his lawyer and this is when he confessed to a 3rd murder. And this time, he ended up taking investigators to the yard and showed exactly where he ended up burying Shirley's mate. So over time, they continued to press Fred for any more information. They felt like there were probably some more murders that he had committed. And at first, he really committed to a story and said there was only those 3, but eventually on March 4 he caved and finally said there's a lot more. So after this, the search became find as many bodies in this yard as you can. They had no idea how many people were buried back there, and by March 9, only 5 days later they had dug up 9 bodies in total. So now they know that Fred was a serial killer. Fred was only able to identify 3 of the bodies, which he likely could have done more, but he didn't really want to help them out. So it was up to the police to identify the rest of the bodies on their own, and eventually they were able to identify all of them. So at first, they were going off with what Fred said, that it was not intentional killing. But eventually, they found evidence that showed otherwise. They found a bunch of stuff in the house, including a long knife, belts and underwear that were tied in a way that could restrain somebody and a lot of adhesive tape that had been formed into weird masks. Several of the bodies had tape around their heads, and one of them even had tubes going up in their nose. This shows that the people were tortured before this happened. And if it was just something out of a fit of rage, you wouldn't spend time to carefully think this out. This was starting to look like a deranged serial killer. And police had a feeling that there were even more bodies to be dug up. And so they came up with a plan to get Fred to tell them where the rest of them were. Fred had talked a lot about how guilty he felt about everything. He said that the spirits of the dead that he had killed haunted him in his life all the time. He talked about how his victims would communicate with him even after they were gone. The police told him that the spirits of the dead that they had already removed from the yard were removed with the bodies, but the spirits of those who were left were still there and can still haunt him. They were trying to kind of guilt him and scare him. And so they kind of played it up like they were really impressed that he could talk to these spirits. And they said he should come out and communicate with the spirits and show where their bodies were located, and they gave him a can of red spray paint. Then he goes ahead and marks where the bodies were with the red spray. And sure enough, the final 9th body was underneath that red X. It took them 11 days to find all 9 bodies, and it was very traumatic for everyone in the area, and for the whole team. It was just horrific. So let's go over the victims. Heather West, Allison Chambers, and Shirley Robinson were found in the back garden of the house. Linda Goff was found underneath the floor in the bathroom. On the opposite side of the house under the concrete and the cellar, Therese Siegenthaler, Lucy Partington, Juanita Mott, Shirley Hubbard and last but not least, Carol Cooper were found. Once police had dug up the remains, they looked for any patterns in the way that they had been killed, and it didn't take long for them to realize that the majority of these people had missing kneecaps, missing hands, and missing feet. In fact, there were over 270 bones missing from all of them, and 8 out of the 9 bodies were buried with some type of bondage, and 6 out of the 9 did not have their kneecaps. And after 55 days of digging, on June 7, 1994, they found the body of Anne McFall. She was the only one that was not buried in the yard that we know of. Her body was actually the 12th and the final body that was found. So you may be wondering, how involved was Rose in all this, and does she get away with it? Fred at this point is telling investigators that she had nothing to do with this. It was all him, but investigators really suspected otherwise, and on April 20, 1994, Rose was arrested. Initially, this was just related to the rape of an 11-year-old girl and the physical assault of an 8-year-old boy, back from the 1970s. She was taken to Pucklead Church Prison to be held in the maximum security way. During this time, she was questioned about the murders, and particularly those of her daughter and Linda Goff, and on April 25 she was formally charged with Linda's murder. By May 6, Fred and Rose were jointly charged with 5 counts of murder. And as soon as Rose was given her charge, she replied by simply saying, "I'm innocent." So, on June 30, 1994, Fred and Rose were brought before the court. Fred was charged with 11 murders and Rose was charged with 9. And this was the first time that the couple had seen each other since Fred's arrest. And Fred was very happy to see Rose, and at one point, he even reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, but Rose actually shrugged him off, and it's really unknown whether she was acting this way because she didn't want to go down with him or if she was actually mad at him and no longer loved him. But publicly, she wanted nothing to do with him. After this, Fred was also charged with the murder of Ian McFall, and Rose was putting on an act that she didn't like Fred anymore, and this really got to Fred and it made him very depressed in jail. While he was in prison, she also refused to respond to any letters that he sent her, and reports were leaking to the press that Rose was very mad and that she felt like Fred had taken everything from her, just making herself the victim. Fred begged his remaining children to go visit Rose in jail and tell her how sorry he was and how much he loved her. But Rose wanted nothing to do with him and gave this no acknowledgement. And this actually pissed Fred off a lot. He ended up withdrawing his previous confession, saying that he was the one to do everything. Now his story had changed again, and this time he said Rose was involved. He ended up accusing his wife of all of the murders except for Anne McFall and for Rena. He actually said that Anne McFall wasn't his fault either, and that Rena had killed Anne. Fred became so depressed, he was delusional. He didn't really know what was going on, he was telling them whatever he could. And unfortunately, he would never even make it to trial. Because on January 1, 1995, Fred actually hanged himself in jail using some sheets and a laundry tag, and he left a suicide note, and at the bottom of it, there was a little picture of a gravestone, and on the gravestone he wrote the words, "In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West, rest in peace where no shadow falls." In perfect peace, he waits for Rose, his wife. So even after all that, he still loved her. So in the end, Rose did go to trial, and the trial was 7 weeks. And after that 7 weeks, the jury came to their conclusion, and they ended up finding Rose guilty of all 10 counts of murder, and Rose was sentenced to life in prison, and the judge made it clear that she should never be paroled. And although she is spending the rest of her life in prison, she always claims that she is innocent. So after all of this, in 1994, the kids that were left that were still alive from their family were given new identities and helped to readjust back to the world. Rose is still alive, and she claims that she had nothing to do with the murders. So I guess we'll never fully know what happened on 25 Cromwell Street. Over time, as they have gone through that house, it was discovered that there were some of those bones, including the kneecaps in the walls. This case is just very disgusting, but has really fascinated a lot of people in England for years. So this was a huge trial. I mean, everyone was very into it. It was definitely one of the most notorious trials of this century. I hope you all have a great day today, and this is all I have for this case. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe and comment and leave a thumbs up down below, and thanks for watching once again.